very much for your kindness. I realize it's late in the day. You've listened to a lot of talks. The usual thing with talks is that the speaker talks and the audience listens. And the important thing is that both end at the same time. However, since it's so late in the day, I will completely forgive if you stop before I do. Sleep is very healthy. It's one of God's blessings. In the instructions given to contributors, it was said that we should not use PowerPoint presentations. So I thought as a replacement of this high-tech procedure, we have an even higher tech set of slides in our own face. There are 2 ears, the 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, and a mouth amounting to 7. And the 2 of them, in fact, are parallel. So my paper is constructed along these slides, which I do not have to project because you have them in your face. The first and the last slide, the hearing, will be quotes from a novel, a fascinating novel by C.S. Lewis, That Hideous Strength, which begins and ends with marriage. And you'll see the order, the parallelism between the others. Cardinal Schönborn liked to compare ITI to St. Anne's on the Hill, which is the important place in C.S. Lewis's novel, That Hideous Strength. It's the residence of Dr. Elwyn Ransom, that's his name. Elwyn means elf-wise friend. It would be a very suitable name for his friend J.R.R. Tolkien. In fact, there are many references to the yet unpublished Lord of the Rings. St. Anne's on the Hill is the place of resistance in the novel against an institution, a terrible institution called the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, abbreviated NICE, NICE. But it's anything but nice. It attempts a technological scientific takeover of England. The central theme of the novel is the narrowing of reason in the scientific and technological revolution of the 16th century, of which Francis Bacon and René Descartes were outstanding advocates. Human power over nature, which implies, Lewis points out, the power of technocrats over the rest of humanity. It's not just the power over nature, it's the power of some human beings over others. This should be the true goal of knowledge. And this goal leads naturally to the choice of a particular science as the master science, namely the science of mechanics, which the ancients understood completely, but they did not privilege it. Among the writings attributed to Aristotle, there is one called Problems in Mechanics. It's probably written by a student of Aristotle, people think, but the prologue is quite interesting. We wonder about what comes to be by technology, contrary to nature, paraphysin, which is what Paul uses to speak about homosexuality, among other things, although there are different modes of contrariety to nature. For the benefit of human beings, so even the notion of progress is there. Nature often does the contrary of what is useful for us. When, therefore, we have to do something contrary to nature, the difficulty of it causes us perplexity, and we need technology. For this reason, we call the technology that helps us in such perplexities mechanics. Mechane in Greek simply means means you use to bring about some result. The words of the poet Antiphon are quite true. By techne, that is technology, we are powerful, even where nature would defeat us. And then, immensely perceptive, mechanical problems have something in common with mathematical and physical theorems. For while mathematics shows the how, physics shows the concerning what. For example, if you construct oars for a trireme, mathematical calculation will show you what the optimal leverage is, but you will use wood and not pudding for your oars. That's the physical part of the observation. Now, since mechanics relies on mathematics, it does not and cannot think about good and bad, beautiful and ugly, living and non-living. For this reason, the project of Francis Bacon and René Descartes leads of itself to an image of the natural world as a value-free mechanism, as an object of power, human power, with little or no meaning in itself. Nature stands below the human person. That's our present cultural situation. And this perception of the natural world, including the sexual human body, below us has a deep impact on the understanding of marriage. Because the person and the body come together with particular intensity in sexual relations between man and woman. And so it's not surprising that C.S. Lewis gives an important place to marriage and contraception in his novel, That Hideous Strength. Here's the first sentence of the novel. So we're at the ear, listening to a piece of text. Matrimony was ordained thirdly, said Jane Sturrock to herself, for the mutual society, help, and comfort that the one ought to have of the other. She had not been in church since her school days, until she went 6 months ago to be married, and the words of the service stuck in her mind. Jane quotes this part of the wedding ceremony in the Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican book, because she feels an intense pain and dissatisfaction with the mutual society between herself and her husband, Mark Sturrock. After an intense life shared during courtship, where they talked a lot to each other, this mutual society seemed to collapse. Mark is absorbed in his own work, and she in hers. It's interesting, though, that Jane, at that point in the novel, does not focus on what the Book of Common Prayer calls the first end of matrimony. Quoting from the Book of Common Prayer, first it was ordained for the procreation of children, to be brought up in the fear and nurture of the Lord, and to praise his holy name. These two, by the way, are the two great common goods of husband and wife. Common goods in the sense that husband and wife share them. They don't belong privately to either one of them, but to both. And these two great common goods are a union of love, that's the first. That's what strikes men and women most immediately. When I came to know my wife, I wanted to be united with her. Of course, the thought of children was somewhat present in my life, in my mind, but union was foremost. It's a union within which then children can be conceived and educated. The union of love is the intrinsic common good of marriage. The growing children, as a fruit of this union, that's the extrinsic good, common good of marriage. And from the beginning, Jane and Mark refused the first of those two great common goods by means of contraception. Quote, it's about Jane. She had always intended to continue her own career as a scholar after she was married. That was one of the reasons why they were to have no children, or at any rate, no children for a long time. Jane was not perhaps a very original thinker, and her plan had been, she's writing on John Donne's religious poetry, her plan had been to lay great stress on Donne's triumphant vindication of the body, particularly ironic arrangement in Sislus. In her own life, Jane is far from such a triumphant vindication. Her procreative life with her husband appeared to her under her, below herself. She did not let biology determine her destiny. It's a phrase you've heard often, isn't it? Against Humanae Vitae. Should biology determine our destiny? She enjoyed the union of love expressed by sex without being burdened by children. As Lewis develops the theme of marriage in the novel, he inverts this order. He suggests that the human body and its meaning does not stand below the person. The nature of the sexual body is deeply personal. In that way, on a par with the person. This is myself. So it's deeply personal, and its full vitality comes from above. It comes down in C.S. Lewis's novel from the gods. The last chapter of Lewis's book is entitled Venus at St. Anne's. I'm not sure to what degree Venus is the goddess determining the life at ITI. If Cardinal Schönborn is right in seeing it as St. Anne upon the hill. But it would be a good thing. So I'll return to that chapter at the very end. Now the second point, we come to the eyes, and one eye is going to be blindness and the other sight. The blindness first. The majority report of the Birth Control Commission appointed by John the 23rd and then continued by Paul VI, it was released against a solemn oath that they would keep the documents confidential, is very much ruled by the perception that the natural world, the bodily world, stands below the person. So exactly Jane Steddock's point of view. The majority report emphatically embraces the project of power over nature, mechanical power over nature. Quote, this is quite an extraordinary quote. The story of God and of man should be seen as a shared work. If you were to say in Scripture, what is the story of God and man? It's a marital union. It's a wedding. The wedding of the Lamb is the end. So it's a shared work. And it should be seen that man's tremendous progress in control of matter by technical means and the universal and total intercommunication, this was before iPhones, that has been achieved corresponds entirely to the divine decrees. So technological progress, plow ahead with it. That's entirely omnino in correspondence with the divine decrees. It would be difficult, I think, to formulate a more unqualified allegiance to this project of power over nature. Nature below us, we make it serve our ends. One can compare this optimism with John Paul's warning in Evangelium Vitae. Quote, nature itself, from being mater, mother, is now reduced to being matter, and is subjected to every kind of manipulation. This is the direction in which a certain technical and scientific way of thinking, prevalent in present-day culture, appears to be leading when it rejects the very idea that there is a truth of creation which must be acknowledged, or a plan of God for life which must be respected. Of course, one finds the same kind of statements in John Paul's two successors, Benedict and Francis. Pope Francis in particular draws on the rich thought of Romano Guardini. He spent several months in Germany studying Romano Guardini, particularly two books that may well be, I think, the best books written on these questions. In English, The End of the Modern World, Das Ende der Neuzeit in German, Power and Responsibility in German simply, Die Macht. Extraordinary books, which Pope Francis knows very well. All three popes identify the blindness of scientific technical reason to any aspect that goes beyond mechanism. They show that the subjection of matter is not only a moral and environmental problem, it is a problem of seeing and understanding, and therefore of action, because our action is dependent on how we see things. Among the various reasons given by the majority report for affirming the legitimacy of contraception, there's one particular one. Listen now to this list. They give a list of factors that should make the Church change its teaching on contraception. The reasons in favor of this affirmation are of several kinds. Social changes in marriage and the family, especially in the role of women, lowering of the infant mortality rate, new bodies of knowledge in biology, psychology, sexuality, and demography, a changed estimation of the personal value and meaning of human sexuality and of conjugal relations, but most of all, so at the end of the list comes a most of all, the duty of man to humanize what is given in nature, to bring it to greater perfection for the life of man. There you have it. Nature below us, needing to be humanized, brought to greater perfection for the life of man. And this superlative, I think, is really important. Among all the reasons for the moral legitimacy of contraception, the foremost reason, the reason that is most of all a reason, is not the liberation of women from excessive pregnancies. It's not the population explosion. It's not a more personalist understanding of sex, but the duty of humanizing what is given in nature. And humanizing, as the document says earlier, is achieved through, quote, tremendous progress in the control of matter by technical means. So when the pill came along, it was part of that duty to humanize nature. We now move from the blind eye to the nostril, one of the nostrils, the good smell. It's interesting how the eye sees what's beautiful, the nose smells what is good. We don't usually call scents beautiful. I think it's on this background that I've just sketched from Lewis, as well as from the majority report, that one can understand the importance of the main paragraph in Humanae Vitae that focuses on the New Testament understanding of nature. It's the beginning of paragraph 8 in Humanae Vitae. This is what it says. Conjugal love will show us its true nature. Notice the word nature is here. So conjugal love will show us its true nature and nobility. Most of all when we have understood it as flowing, as it were, from the highest fountain, from God. That was Professor Dollner's theme. From God, who is love. That's the first scriptural quote from the first letter of John, chapter 4, verse 8. Then comes a second from Ephesians. And who is the Father, quote, from whom every family, it's the usual translation of patria. The Vulgate has every fatherhood, that is also a possible translation of patria, in heaven and on earth is named. So God is love, and God is Father, origin of a family. It is far from the truth that marriage is born from chance or from the blind course of natural forces. Those are below us. In reality, God the Creator established marriage wisely and with foresight by his mind to realize his design of love among human beings. It's interesting, this text doesn't reserve the word nature for what is subpersonal. It's a very common opposition, the personal and the natural. It applies it to the personal sphere of love between man and woman, which is inseparably bodily and spiritual. It sees love as coming from above, from God, who already in himself as God is an exchange of gift and love. Fascinating. One can relate these two texts, 1 John and Ephesians, to what later appears in the encyclical as the two meanings of the conjugal act, namely the unitive and the procreative meaning. Simply talking about love focuses on the unitive, the fatherhood of God, clearly on the procreative. Behind these two passages in Humanae Vitae, one can hear the first chapter of Genesis, which you interpreted so beautifully. 6 times in that text, God says, the writer of Genesis says, but it is the word of God, and God saw that it was good. 6 times. The 7th and last time, so he counted the holes in the human head. The 7th and last time after the creation of man and woman, it says, and God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Tov me'od is the Hebrew. It is the first congratulation, one can say, addressed to a married pair and the human family as Mazel Tov, which is still the Yiddish congratulation at weddings. Now we come to the middle point, the mouth. We need to take in and begin to digest what this primacy of the good in God's intention really means. God's design of love is not imposed arbitrarily on some indifferent matter. In his wisdom, the good shapes the deepest natures of his creatures. When one asks, what is it about any natural being or about any act, the deepest answer flows from, for the sake of a specific good, due to its goodness. For example, seeing is the act that belongs to human eyes exactly as eyes. It's impossible to understand what eyes are without pointing to this act, which is their good and their end. It's also impossible to understand what the act of seeing is without pointing in turn to its good and end, which are the objects of sight possessed in the act of seeing. The end allows one to understand from within what the act and the organ of sight are. So the end is not imposed. It shapes the nature. The intelligibility flows from the goodness of the end to the nature. The good is what is most intimate to the eye and to the act of seeing, more intimate than they are to themselves. Eyes are most themselves in seeing, and seeing is most itself in reaching the object of sight. And the case of the human mind is similar. I'm trying to give examples of this non-arbitrary, non-voluntaristic imposition of meaning on the part of God. It's much more. It's the shaping of natures. The case of the human mind is similar. It's impossible to understand what the human mind is without pointing to the act of thinking, which is the good the mind is directed toward. And it's in turn impossible to understand the act of thinking without pointing to its good, namely truth. When we say about what is, it is, and about what isn't, it isn't, then our statements are true. If this correspondence between thought and being were impossible, if there were no truth to be known, thought would be impossible from its very roots. Its nature as an activity flows from the goodness of truth. The goodness of truth is most interior to thought, more interior than thought is to itself. Again, thought is most itself in raising the question of truth and attempting to answer it. Likewise, the nature of marriage and of the conjugal act flow from the goodness of these two constitutive goods, union and procreation. Point 5, and this corresponds to the New Testament concept of nature because it focuses first on love. The reason Humanae Vitae gives for its rejection of contraception is the indissoluble link between the two meanings of the conjugal act, the unitive and the procreative meaning. Paul VI says they come to be with each other. And they come to be with each other because they are written into the very nature of man and woman. So the word nature appears there. Their nature as persons, as personal animals. John Paul, in the Theology of the Body, adds a word that Paul VI doesn't use, and it's fascinating. He says the two meanings are not only realized together with each other, but through each other. The indissolubility of the two meanings is a matter of fact, not of morals. The point is not that the connection should not be dissolved. It cannot be dissolved. The two meanings are ends because they come to be through each other, depend on each other in such a way that they stand or fall together. One cannot take one away and leave the other standing. Just as each comes to be through the other, so each is destroyed when the other is destroyed. John Paul says, when the conjugal act is deprived of potential parenthood, it also ceases to be an act of love. The conjugal act is, by its nature, by what it is as a human act, procreative because it's unitive, and unitive because it's procreative. You could say it's unitively procreative and procreatively unitive. That's the thesis of John Paul. Now, an objection by Luke Timothy Johnson, whom I respect very much as a biblical scholar. He's a very sensitive, sophisticated biblical scholar. Although here, well, take in the text here. He objects against exactly this thesis of John Paul. John Paul recognizes from one side of his mouth two ends of sexual love, namely unitive intimacy and procreation. But from the other side of the mouth, he declares that if in an act of intercourse procreation is blocked, not only that end has been cancelled, but the end of unitive intimacy has as well. He has thereby, despite his protestations to the contrary, simply reduced the two ends to one. This can be demonstrated by applying his logic in reverse. Would we insist that an act of sexual intercourse that did not manifest unitive intimacy also cancels the procreative meaning of the act? The procreative end of the act is what he says. And then he adds, what I think is really a vile sentence, but the papal position could actually be read as applying, as approving, as moral, an act of intercourse within marriage that was coerced, even violently, as long as a contraceptive was not used. So what about the claim of Luke Timothy Johnson that if a man rapes his wife, the procreative meaning is preserved? As Paul VI and John Paul use it, the word procreation doesn't simply mean reproduction. Cows eat. They don't dine when they're together in a meadow. Dining signifies a distinctively human, a personal way of eating. In a similar way, cows reproduce but don't procreate. Procreation signifies the distinctively human or personal way of generating. There's a similar difference between the words sex and conjugal act. Conjugal act, as John Paul uses it all the time, is not an antiquated way of saying sex or a prudish euphemism for it, but it's the name of sex in its fully human form as a personal act between the spouses. Sex is to conjugal act as reproduction is to procreation, and both are as eating is to dining. I think that disposes of his objection. But one has to go a level deeper. By the innermost energy of the love between man and woman, the space of love built by the conjugal act between them isn't a space in which they want to remain alone. It builds a house. And if it builds a house, it builds hospitality. And the first and most important guests are children. So in this light, you can understand how the conjugal act is unitively procreative, that is, procreative through being unitive. The union it produces is an open union that leads of itself to hospitality for children. The wider space of a home that flows from the more intimate space created by the love of their parents is the space children need. From a house, it creates a home. Created by God, who is love, out of love and for love, a child ought to be conceived and educated in such a space of love. Now we get to the sixth point, and that's the most direct response. That's the seeing corresponding to the blindness of the majority report. And it's the thesis that the unitive meaning comes to be through the procreative meaning and is destroyed if the procreative meaning is destroyed. I already quoted the text where John Paul formulates this point very sharply. When the conjugal act is deprived of its inner truth because it is deprived of its potential parenthood, it also ceases to be an act of love. Now, on the face of it, that claim seems outrageously unjust. And Luke Timothy Johnson feels it as outrageously unjust, and he is outraged by it. Contraception doesn't stop the effective bonds between husband and wife, the way the collapse of a bridge interrupts the traffic across the river, or the flick of the main power switch in the basement of a house turns off all lights in the house all at once. On the contrary, the reason why couples use contraceptives is to express their love for each other sexually, even when the conception of a child should for various reasons be avoided. So contraception gives more room to the union of love. That's the second major argument in the majority report. The first argument is the duty of technology. The second is the furthering of love between man and woman. It seems to me that in thinking through this objection, one needs to focus on the very specific form of unity that arises from the procreative meaning. It's the unity of those who do what men and women do to become parents. This form of unity between a man and a woman can be realized only by this act. Only by an act that is by its nature procreative. It can't be achieved by holding hands or mutual masturbation None of those will lead to pregnancy. This specific form of the unity of love is destroyed when the procreative meaning is destroyed. It's the specifically conjugal form of the union of love. Other forms of unitive meaning, such as those expressed by caressing or kissing, can still exist, but they won't remain unaffected by the disappearance of the specifically spousal meaning of union. Just as human sexual organs are by their nature generative at all times, even when they're not being used for generation. So that's a permanent characteristic of our organs. So a conjugal act is procreative by its nature, even when no child can be conceived. The nature, which is constituted as a specific nature by its inner ordering to an end, remains the same on a deep level, whatever the effect of the act may turn out to be. And so, this is now a consequence. By performing an act that is shaped in its very nature by the good of children, spouses say to each other, "You are the one with whom I want to have children. I want our children to be both from you and from me together, to be formed by both of our bodies and both of our minds together, because I love you." It's in this way that the conjugal act is unitive by being procreative in its nature. It establishes or reenacts a particular kind of unity between man and woman, namely the unity called marriage. This seems to be what John Paul has in mind. Now, the seventh point, we go back to C.S. Lewis's novel, and I will read you a passage. It's about the conversion of Mark. The novel begins with Jane's complaints about the collapse of their union of love. It ends with Mark's conversion that allows a union of love. You'll see, procreation is not explicitly mentioned, but what is explicitly mentioned is something John Paul puts at the very center of his theology of the body, namely a particular gift of the Holy Spirit called reverence. He thinks reverence is the real backbone of sexual purity. It's the backbone of a spirituality of conjugal life. Mark Studdock became deeply involved in the NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. But he experiences a conversion. He is able to liberate himself. At the very end of the book, he makes his way up to St. Anne's on the Hill, where the angel that rules the planet Venus has descended and, like the goddess Venus, spreads an intense venereal atmosphere among all animals, both irrational animals and rational. So Mark comes under the influence of Venus, and this is now a description of the influence of Venus. His mind was not at ease. He knew that he was going to meet Jane, and something was beginning to happen to him which ought to have happened to him far earlier. That same laboratory outlook upon love. It's very interesting. Laboratory outlook upon love. It's the scientific, technical way of looking at love as an epiphenomenon. The real thing that happens is particles in motion. So, that same laboratory outlook upon love which had forestalled in Jane the humility of a wife Humility in the sense of self-abandonment and total gift to another. Had equally forestalled in him during what passed for courtship the humility of a lover. Or, if there had ever arisen in him at some wiser moment the sense of, quote, beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear. This is a quote from Romeo and Juliet. It's the first impression Romeo has of Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. A beauty too rich for use, and for earth too dear. It's above earth. Her beauty is above earth. It's a message from above. Now belated, after all favors had been conceded, that is, they've had sex for 6 months, the unexpected misgiving, I'm unworthy of this, was coming over him. He tried to shake it off. They were married, weren't they? And they were sensible, modern people. What could be more natural and more ordinary? But then certain moments of unforgettable failure in their short married life rose in his imagination. How had he dared, that is, to take her sexually? Her driven snow, her music, her sacrosanctity. How had he dared? And dared too, with no sense of daring, nonchalantly, in careless stupidity. Yes, of course, it was she who had allowed him to pass the hedge or the wall around the garden in the Song of Songs. And he had taken blackguardly advantage of that noble error in her judgment and had behaved as if he were native to that fenced garden and even its natural possessor. All this, which should have been uneasy joy, it's uneasy joy in courtship. All of this, which should have been uneasy joy, was torment for him because it came too late. Now, Venus helps them over this barrier, but still, what Venus instills in him is what Plato would recognize as erotic passion. Eros in the full form of awe and reverence for the mysteries of beauty that surpass us, that are greater than us, that we can't simply put under our power. This is exactly where John Paul locates the center of conjugal spirituality. Thank you very much for your attention.